Really is my pleasure, Rashina, for you to join us today. And so Professor Rashina Hoda is the Associate Dean of Academic Development in the Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University, Melbourne. She is an award-winning researcher and an international expert in human-centered software engineering, specializing in agile software development and grounded theory. And the students have read your paper on grounded theory and agile. And Rashina was awarded a Distinguished Paper Award for her grounded theory of becoming agile at ICSE, a paper I read actually several times. And ICSE, as I've mentioned to the students already, is the most prestigious software engineering conference. So this was a great award for you to win. Recently, she's been focusing on effective agile requirements engineering, including looking at pandemic programming, so looking at the effect of the pandemic on programming, and is also looking at harnessing artificial intelligence to drive decision-making in agile software engineering. That sounds super cool. I have to hear more about that at some point. Before joining Monash, Rashina was a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. And she completed her PhD in New Zealand as well. And you also, I think, did your bachelor's in the US of A, right?
That's right, at Louisiana State University.
Yeah, so you've like covered quite some continents here.
Hey, I'm a mixed bag.
Yeah, I think that's why you know so much. So actually all of Rashina's research is industry-based, so it's great that you're one of our guests because our course is about bridging industry and research. And in 2019, she gave a TED Talk. She introduced the concept of an agile nation, applying agile principles at the wider societal level to solve national and global challenges. Yeah, as I mentioned, she is spending her weekend, a long weekend no less, so it's Saturday morning for you. For us, it's Friday afternoon to talk to us today. So Rashina, welcome. And yeah, thank you for being here. And you're going to start.
So much.
Yeah. So I should let you share perhaps if you have some slides to show.
Yep, I do. Thank you so much, Peggy. It's such a pleasure to be here, honestly. Weekend, no weekend. I'm super excited. I mean, and the other thing is I haven't taught in a while, so this is doubly exciting. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to get straight into it. This one's it's an interesting topic. It's one that's really close to my heart, and I can talk forever. So Peggy's gonna have to come in and say, no, that's enough. All right. So I'm sure you've kind of discussed this, but I always like to start with the why for anything, pretty much, before we get into the what's and the hows and the whys, or rather the hows. So why research methods? For me, it's sort of kind of like, thinking about it as a systematic approach to conducting research. That's the sort of formal definition. But really, it's about the fact that you've got a map for a world that has been charted by other people who've been on that journey before, right? So they will then share their tools and tricks and tips with you, guidelines and so forth. However, that does not mean it's some kind of a cookie cutter style, standardized experience. The experience is still your own. It's going to be absolutely unique. You're going to find things that have worked for others that won't work for you, and so forth. But it makes sense to apply a research method. And most people here, do we have a software engineering background? Yes?
Yes. Yeah. Pretty much most are software engineering.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to pull on some software engineering examples. It's like with software development, sure, you can have a team that's developing software without a particular method, right? But when you do use a method, like whether it's waterfall or spiral or RUP or agile, the fact is that someone's done it before and they have perfected it over the years, and so it makes sense to use those particular steps. That's the same thing with research. You have a job at hand, some people have done it before, and they're sharing their sort of guidelines with you, and you're trying to sort of follow in their path. Cool, that's kind of the why. Now, in order to do it, just like with software, we've got a bunch of different methods. We've got a bunch of different research methods that you can apply. So depending on what it is that you're wanting to do. So these are kind of tools for the job. A lot of us tend to get a bit pedantic about this, and it's like, Agile is better than waterfall, and RUP is better than. and the same can happen in the research world, but most of us who've been here long enough know that these are really tools. These are kind of tools for the job. So if you're wanting to do a particular kind of thing, study a particular kind of problem, then a particular kind of method will apply. So if you are, for example, wanting to make a change in the environment that you're studying, so you're not just studying and understanding it, you're wanting to influence the behavior and perhaps change your practice, then action research is a really good one. So that the action research has an advantage over some of the others, where it goes above and beyond the understanding and explaining, and it goes into the actual changing of the environment. There's case studies, there's ethnography experiments that you can conduct with people. It sounds a bit like, some evil professor. But honestly, I mean, you're all ethical with ethics involved, and you can do proper experiments. You can have a control group that tries out a particular method or practice, or rather not, and then the experimental group that tries out that method and see the differences and so forth. Obviously, it's challenging. Experiments are challenging because, real life is full of variations, and it's very difficult to set up these things. But people do them and do them really well. There's research that is survey-based, so survey research, and of course, Granite theory, which I'm here to talk to you about today. So, now again, the why is important for me. So why Granite theory? The thing that excites me most about Granite theory, compared to all of the other methods, is it's one of the only ones that you can claim helps you generate a theory, right? And we'll get into what that means in a bit, like what is a theory. So we'll get there. But it also helps you study a real world problem. So it's not a theory where you're kind of sitting in your house or in your lab and thinking about how things might work and then come up with a model. It doesn't work like that. This one's more about going out there into the field, going out there into the industry, into the problems, and then building up the story and building up the theory bottom up, right? It's what's problematic for the practitioners. It's not what is the most problematic thing for you, although you may have been a practitioner. And that's another interesting one, to sort of separate yourself from the environment that you're studying. But most of all, in software engineering in particular, the idea of being able to combine a research method that, or rather combine the practical relevance. So studying something that is of relevance to the software developers and the software practitioners, and at the same time achieving something that is theoretically robust and full of rigor, that has been dubbed as the grand challenge of software engineering. And again, what excites me about Granite theory is it's one of those methods that allows you to combine them. So you're studying something that is inherently practice-based, it's super relevant, but at the end of it, you come up with a theory that is hopefully robust because you've done it, quite rigorously, the whole process. So yeah, that combination really excites me. All right, so where did it start? It started in 1967. In fact, again, an Agile analogy, just like Agile methods were sort of, the whole idea came about and was named technically and formally in 2001 under the Agile Manifesto. Granite theory came to be and was named in 1967, but it was resulted from this research that two sociologists were doing, Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss. And they were working on this quite a bunch of methodologies and, procedures and steps. And that then came to be the Granite theory method, right? So you see the word discovery of the Granite theory. And that's, again, parallel for me in terms of looking at Agile software development, because it wasn't that people came up with the idea of Agile as so much as they came up with the terminology. The ideas were already there. People had been practicing different types of what we now call Agile methods, and it came under that umbrella in 2001 with the manifesto. So very, very similar here. It is a sociological research method to study a social problem. And so coming from sociology and focused on the social side of things. Why grounded theory? Why that name? The name comes from, it's grounded in practical evidence, right? So it's coming from the industry, as I said before, and or practice. And it's theory because, well, that's the resulting outcome. And again, we'll look at several examples of what that looks like. But essentially, it's the idea of relationship between the key patterns. And one thing about Granite theory, the outcome of it, is that it focuses on the hows and the whys of the phenomena studied. So it's not just limited to the what. It's not just what's happening, it's why it's happening and how it's happening. So it goes deep. It's quite a deep dive. In fact, the other day, Peggy and I were talking about this, and we discovered we both use the same analogy, which is like deep diving rather than snorkeling. So it really is a deep dive into the whole phenomena, and once you come out of it, you are, well, hopefully more enlightened, and you come out with a theory and you're able to affect practice. So that there is the book. In fact, these days I'm surrounded by Granite theory books, so I'll show you. Ta-da, that one there. And right, now what Granite theory did when it was introduced is it really challenged the status quo. At that time, which is around the 1960s, there was a really strong hold of quantitative research in sociology. Right? And this research, it was not just quantitative, it was considered adequate, it was considered important, it was considered sort of valuable, right? Qualitative was starting to diminish and be looked upon as anecdotal, well, evidence, and it's not really robust because there are no numbers in it and whatnot. So it was that time of sort of the phase in research for sociology where qualitative was really just looked down upon, and quantitative was looked at this is certain science, this is accurate, this is precise. Qualitative is like, yeah, someone said something or someone thinks something, that's not science. So when Glaser and Strauss proposed this, what they did was they challenged that status quo, and very strongly, and they said, look, two things. One is by introducing Granite theory as a very super robust and systematic method, they restored that importance of qualitative research, right? They're saying, look, this is not just anecdotal. We have a super systematic and rigorous method of doing this, and we can show you how, right? And that's why they wrote the book. And the second thing that they did was they said, it's all fine to have a theory, take a theory that exists and then go and verify it, right? That's what's kind of the hypothetical, deductive, weird sounding terminology there means. So if you break it down, it's like hypothetical is driven by the hypothesis, which is pre-existing. You're not forming it, somebody else did. You take somebody's theory or some existing theory. And the deductive part is then from there, you're trying to see if it applies to specific instances, right? So you're going from the theory to specific instances, right? Top down. So hypothetical deductive research was the status quo at the time, and they challenged it, and they said, it's fine to be verifying theory, but what about creating theory? Why are we losing track of, where do theories come from in the first place? Someone's got to create them, right? So that's what Granite theory did. It said qualitative is important. It didn't say quantitative isn't, but yes, qualitative is important. And also that theory development is just as important as theory verification. So those two important things that they did for the community. All right, if I were to go into every single detail of Granite theory, we'd be here for a month. So I'm going to give a very, very high level overview. You've read the paper, hopefully, and a few others in your own time. But the idea is generally that this is an iterative method. And again, that was quite different to some of the methods that were already out there. A lot of the research methods are some or the other form of, again, the software example I'll take is kind of a phase-wise sequential waterfall approach, if you like. So you do this, then you do this, and you formalize the problem, you do your literature review, you conduct the data, you analyze things, you write up your report, boom, 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 done. Granite theory is saying, actually, we're not so sure because this is theory development. This is no ordinary business. We're not sure what we're going to end up with, right? There's uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty. So it has to be iterative by nature. And the same principle with Agile, right? There's so much uncertainty in the types of products that we're developing these days. You have to be iterative. There has to be a feedback loop. And that's what's happening with Granite theory. So you've got iterative and interleaved data collection and analysis. You do a bit of data collection, you do that analysis, right? And then you see what the data is telling you. Based on that, you will then sort of go into the next phase and collect some more data. And you might change who you're talking to. You might change some of your questions, like refine them. And so on. So that's the feedback loop that goes into it. And that means it enables you to constantly narrow the topic down and come, to a point where it's super sort of specialized and saying something very specific about a very specific topic. That you may or may not have started that way, right? When you started, it was sort of, broad. Inductive and bottom-up approach. So this is exactly opposite to what I said before about the hypothetical deductive approach. Inductive meaning you're starting with evidence of specific instances in the real world that you're observing firsthand, ideally. And then from that, you're comparing to each other and finding patterns in that data and constantly raising that up through levels of, increasing levels of abstraction, up to a point when then you have a more general something to say about that entire context that you've studied. So from specific instance to the general. So that's bottom up as inductive. Now, as well as that, so these are already some quite, different viewpoints in the 1960s compared to what was popular then. But not just that, Granite theory proposed a bunch of absolutely new and exciting data analysis procedures. So you would have heard about open coding, constant comparison, selective coding, and theoretical coding, axial coding, and we'll see that in a bit. So with open coding, again, I could go on and on. I mean, we can have an entire seminar just on open coding. But to give you a taste, like a really high-level overview, and then I'll give you an example. The idea is you go out and do an interview. So you do an interview for, say, an hour. An hour's worth of interview that is recorded on a device, when transcribed, will sort of translate into, say, 6 to 7 pages, A4 pages of printed text. And when you sit down to analyze that, to find the key terms that, that's the whole process. Open coding is finding those key ideas in, all right, what is being talked about. And you go through that in the initial stages when you don't have any preconceived ideas and you're just starting with whatever the person is saying, it can come up with a mountain of what we call codes, right? Just mountains of codes. Because normally as we talk human beings, right, we're not talking in, now I'm going to talk about this category A and only about A, and you can derive clear, inferences about it. We talk about everything. And so when you are looking at the text and you're analyzing it, you will find that people, go here and there, and it's up to you to, draw out the essence of the talk. All right, here's an example if people have seen it, and I should have put in a sort of graphical image now that to come to think of it. But how many people have seen people take visual notes of talks, right? Like on an A4 sheet of, right? So that for me is open coding, honestly. So you're seeing somebody present in real time, for example, and hats off to those people. I would love to. I'm actually trying to learn visual notes taking right now. It's amazing. So it's the essence of the entire 1 hour talk on an A4 sheet of paper. It's visual as well, but it captures every important thing, right? And that is the essence of open coding. So now that was open coding. Constant comparison is when you're comparing the essence of what this person said with the essence of what this person said and trying to find the patterns. And then imagine doing that for every one of your interviews or every one of your observations. And that's constantly comparing one to the other. And that's where the rigor comes from. It is not for the faint-hearted. It takes a lot of effort. But yeah, and it gets better. It gets better because you're doing that feedback loop, right? Which means you're starting to focus progressively only on the patterns that are emerging as the strongest and the most interesting patterns. So selective coding then is basically, you're still coding, but you're now coding selectively for the patterns that are starting to emerge, right? And not just generally coding for everything. Theoretical coding, I'm afraid there's no way I can try and cover that now, but maybe if it comes up in the questions later. Memoing is the idea of taking field notes, right? It's everything that, you come out from a session of data collection, having talked to somebody, having done a sort of field trip to the workplace, having looked at things, sat in a meeting, whatever. And it's not the notes that you take in the meetings. You can take those too. Those are observational notes, right? Now, those are pretty much this happened and that person came in and then they said this. That's very factual. Memoing is when you've got a moment to sort of sit down and then distill everything and filter everything and try to put things together and connect. All right, I noticed this was a bit strange, but I also noticed that at the other place. And these guys seem to have a problem with this, and these guys seem to have sorted it. That's interesting. Now you are the glue. And memoing is that opportunity to, start to make those connections, those little connections that then, end up becoming those relationships I talked about, or, the beginnings of hypotheses. So memoing is super important. This is where a lot of Granite theorists go wrong, is they skip memoing. So you cannot have a solid theory if you don't have memoing. You have to allow yourself to be reflective and to really use yourself as the medium that connects everything. And then there's theoretical sampling, sensitivity, sorting, saturation, but you're going to have to call me for another session. Again, if any of these sort of spark an interest, you can let me know after I'm finished talking. But essentially, these are all elements that help you bridge that gap between the very substantial practical evidence and getting it to a point where it can be called a theory. So it's the stuff that makes it theoretical, right? Okay, this you would have seen in that paper, the 2011 Empirical Software Engineering paper, which was my attempt as a software engineer by training to come up with, well, we all do this instinctively. We need a flow chart. If it's a process, it's got to have a flow chart. So that's what I did. And that was my attempt to try to describe Glaser's version of Granite theory, albeit with a few of my own tweaks, like a literature review before and after that he doesn't really talk about and so forth. So all the stuff that I talked about, this is one, in one graphical view. Now my personal view has actually changed from this, but again, that's for another time. So this is your classic Granite theory, pretty much. Okay, so an example. I like examples. All right, this one I'm drawing from a very fresh. This is fresh, hot off the press, real world Scrum, a Granite theory of variations in practice that was accepted to TSC just a couple of weeks. No, not even a week ago. Okay, so it's hot off the press, and this one we've included, and it's available. The preprint is available online. It's one of my PhD students, Zainab, myself, and Kelly at Auckland. So if you look into what you see on the screen, this is your left. Open coding starts with open coding, right? So for this one, what we did was we wanted to know how Scrum, the Agile method, varies in practice as compared to what it says in the book. So we'll see at the top, it says in practice data, and that is data that we collected from interviews and observations by going into the industry. And at the bottom, it says by the book data, and that is data from the Scrum primer and from the Scrum guide. So these are your fundamental sort of very short introductions to Scrum kind of literature. So this again goes to show that your analysis doesn't need to be limited to industry. It can actually involve texts that are pre-existing, but in this case, we wanted to compare the two, right? So we're going to compare what it says in the book compared to what's actually happening in the industry. So if you'll see at the top, it says P18. So that's our way of coding people. So it could have been, I don't know, Jane or Kavita or whoever. We can't name them because there's confidentiality. So we'll say something like P1, P2, and so forth. So they said something like, okay, I kind of guided her and then she started submitting pull requests. So this is about self-assignment, the idea that you can pick what you want to do in an agile team. And the other person, which is P28, who would have been from a completely different organization, said, all right, I picked the story, so user stories myself. Now from that, we're driving codes, right? This is what we mean by coding. It's not the software coding, although the principle is the same. You're abstracting something into a coded format. So you're leading the assistance in assignment. Somebody is actually helping people, assign to themselves, whereas there are other people who are actually going ahead and self-assigning, and so forth. So that then leads to concepts like there are techniques for self-assignment. That's under the concepts area. And what does the book say? So we then compare it to the book. The book would have said something like you must limit one item. Every time you pick a task, you can only pick one task at a time. We didn't see that in practice. Sometimes people would pick more, or sometimes people would share, right? So that's where the differences start to come up. So the next step from here is axial coding. And axial coding is saying, all right, so you see the raising levels of abstraction. Hopefully, you can revisit this in your own time and sort of really walk through it. I'm afraid I can't do justice to the whole thing right now, but so assignment techniques, and then we start to see variations in assignment, in estimation, in work breakdown. So things that the book said it should be done this way and what people are actually doing. So that's what we started to find, yeah? So we found variations in practices, in the roles, in the artifacts, all three things. People tweak everything. And then that then led to finally the theory, which talks about Scrum variations in practice, which is across three main categories: the practices, the artifacts, and the rules. Okay, it took a while, but we got it. Cool, so what is the outcome of a Granite theory? Now see the cartoon there is about, we all make assumptions. It's like trying to find shapes in clouds, right? Oh, that one looks like a bunny. No, that one looks like a meteor. Well, some assumptions are more accurate than others, right? So that's what we're talking about. There's no one theory that, even if you had the same set of data, if Peggy was to interpret it or analyze it and I were to do it separately, we're likely to come up with different theories. In fact, if we came up with the exact same theory, it would be very strange. Not just strange, it would be like, ooh, telepathy, right? So we see different shapes in these clouds, but some are more accurate because you have that evidence and you've gone through that rigor to come up with that idea. So it's supposed to explain what's happening in the real world, but it's also meant to be a little bit predictive in that, all right, what is likely to happen in similar contexts? Another thing to confuse you is Granite theory is we use the word for the method and we use it for the outcome, right? So if you wanted to differentiate, you would say something like the Granite theory method and the outcome is a Granite theory or just simply theory. So, all right, as promised, what is a theory? It is the key patterns, right? The categories and the subcategories that you just saw in the concepts, and the relationships between them, right? So what are the emerging hypotheses between them? This is one of my favorite ones that came out on, Twitter and Facebook and everywhere else, actually. You see on the top left, there's data, and we all have access to data. When you start to analyze things, it starts to become information, yes? When you start to connect the dots between things, right? So you can imagine this is data collected from different sources. And when you start to connect these things, it becomes knowledge, yeah? And then suddenly, as I said before, you realize, wait, what's happening here is similar to what's happening here, but the reason it happens here is because of what this person told me. And so you connect that sort of, one connection, and that's a relationship. And it's, well, in this cartoon, it's about, insight and wisdom. But if you have no, systematic method of going about this, and you're looking at information and just taking a random guess, that's what you get, what's at the bottom right. It's a conspiracy theory. It's not a grounded theory. It's like, oh, I just took a guess. Okay, so I'm going to show you some sample grounded theories. This one is the one that Peggy mentioned. It's the theory of becoming agile from ICSE 2017. And you will see in this diagram, which I'm not particularly, I have to confess, proud of graphically. I think, academically, yeah, I need to be better with my art. It's boring, look at it. But it does the job, I guess. It talks about the main categories, which is what's changing when you become agile. What is changing is your software development practices, your team practices, your management approach, your reflective practices, and your culture. So 5 main categories that are transitioning or changing. And then you'll see those H1 and H2 and H3. Those are the relationships. So key patterns and relationships. And I'm not going to go through each one of them, but the idea is that each of those, H1, H2, can then be sort of put into a hypothesis form, and you're making a guess, or rather you're proposing that this such a thing happens. So I'll just go through one of them. For example, H2 here. The transitions in the team practices and the management approach tend to reflect and adapt to each other. So what does this mean? This means when a team is trying to become agile, right? If the team themselves, if the developers are trying to become more empowered and take on more autonomy, and at the same time, the management is letting them do it, they're both moving in the same direction, that's when you achieve self-organization in the entire team. If you've got one trying and the other one working against it, it's not going to happen. Right? So that's the relationship we've talked about between those two, practices and management approach. They must both transition in the same direction. So if the managers are saying, all right, we're doing agile from tomorrow onwards, you are entitled and free to do the task that you want to do, go select a task. And I've seen this in practice, right? And some of the newer teams, they're like, yay, we've got freedom. And then they look up to their manager and they're like, what do we do? So they're clearly not ready. They like that idea, but they're not ready. So that's the journey that the agile teams need to be on. Cool. So there are, hypotheses like that. Another one is, again, this is again pretty fresh. It's about 2 to 3 weeks old that came out. Same team. It talks about self-assignment and how agile teams make it work. This is just, you can read it, of course, in your own free time if you're interested. I just wanted to give you a flavor of what these, what the end product looks like. So on your right, the green bit is the end product, is the complete theory. And you will see it's got all of those boxes are the key categories and subcategories. And then within that, of course, there are a bunch of concepts that are encapsulated in that idea. And the paper would go into the detail of each and every one of them. And then, of course, those arrows that you see are the relation. Cool, one more. And this is the real world Scrum. Again, the one I used before to show you. So the main research question was how, when, and why does Scrum practice vary from Scrum by the book? And so we've described that. And then we came up with a classification approach. Again, sorry, but I'm not going to be able to go through in detail here. I just wanted to give you a flavor, a taste of what these end products look like. So basic essence here is there are different versions of Granite theory, just like we've got different versions of, there's iOS and there are Windows and whatnot. Okay, then there's evaluation criteria. I love this cartoon. I have a theory. No, you have a hypo. Technical differences, but each of the versions have their own evaluation criteria. All right, in software engineering, the Granite theory is rising rapidly. People are super interested. My kind of take on why this is happening is for 2 main reasons. One is that software engineering is super human-centered, right? Especially with the advent of Agile, the people became the center of everything, right? And Granite theory is a study that is a sort of a research method that enables the study of human and social aspects. So it makes sense that this is all, coming together. And the other thing is software engineering is the youngest engineering discipline. We're only 50 years old or 51 years old. And Granite theory enables theory development. Every discipline, in order to mature as part of your natural journey, is to develop solid theories. So that's where I see the contribution. All right, so love this quote. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. So there's actually quite a bit of challenges when it comes to practicing Granite theory in software engineering. I know this firsthand from practicing it, from supervising people, from reviewing it. And so some of them are apprehension. When people meet me, a lot of them are like, oh my God, this is too scary. This is too, it sounds super complicated, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of misconceptions and apprehensions out there. Misunderstanding of what actually happens. Unfortunately, there's misuse and abuse. It's like, oh, we're not sure how it went. It kind of just evolved. Let's just call it Granite theory. So that happens. Random adaptations. People feel like they need to adapt, but they really can't justify why they need to adapt. And then they fall into that gap with the reviewers who are like, you've adapted, that's fine, but why did you do it? And then you have the evaluations, and often Granite theories are evaluated either overly harshly or they're super trusting and they're like, yeah, that's a good theory, let's publish it. And then you don't check the evidence. So it's a very bipolar evaluation format. Okay, so I'm gonna sort of wrap up with this, which is in the evolution of Granite theory, we started off with a classic in 1967. In 1990, Strauss and Corbin, gave another twist to it with a structured approach. In 2006, is one of my favorite books, as I think is Peggy's as well. This one here, Constructing Granite Theory by Shamez. Shamez unfortunately passed away earlier this year. A great blow to the Granite theory community. But she sort of talked about the constructivist view. Is another sort of take on things. And what I'm hoping to do, and this is a bit ambitious, is come up with this idea of socio-technical Granite theory, which is the book I'm currently writing. So yeah, wish me luck. I don't know where it's gonna go, what it's gonna do, but this is my version of Granite theory for socio-technical domains like software engineering, computer science, information systems, HCI, artificial intelligence. Anybody in this social technical domain that wants to use Granite theory, I'm hoping to sort of write that up for them. Yeah, that's it. That's me. So theory development. I hope I have A, not scared you, and B, maybe a little bit inspired you to look into the idea of developing theories. Here we go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much again. So we've got a few minutes for questions. So let me just switch to that. I'm going to start with a couple.
Okay.
If it's okay. Because one of them I'm super curious about. How did you get interested in grounded theory? Like,
ooh, that's a good one.
How did you end up here?
Ooh, that's such a philosophical question on a Saturday morning, Heidi. With Granite theory in particular, it was during my PhD. First, I got interested in Agile. Right? I got introduced to Agile as part of my master's, and I knew that I wanted to study the human side of things. And because of that, then my supervisor suggested Granite theory as a possibility. Yeah, so it kind of came, the chicken and egg, but Agile came first and the human aspects of Agile, and therefore we started to look at qualitative methods, and Granite theory came from there.
Wow. So another question I have, and this is just more of a practical one, and then I'm going to get into the student questions, which are really good. Is there always a core theme? You alluded to this a little bit in your paper, but
yeah, like the core category.
Yeah, the core category, sorry. Yeah,
absolutely. So if you're following Glacier, and this is where the sort of differences in the versions start to arrive, you are supposed to have a sense of a core category or your main theme. It's kind of like, what is the main glue that connects all of the other categories together, right? So that is supposed to happen. But with practice, because I've then also used Strauss and Corbinian style of Granite theory and others, my own, you don't have to have a core category. Mm-hmm. What you do need to have is a number of key categories that stick together and make sense to be in a group together, and that's telling a larger story.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah,
that's kind of, yeah.
So I mean, the reason that I was super excited that you agreed to come and talk to the students is that I think of all of the methods that I mean, and this maybe is a biased view, but of, all of the methods I have tried to use in software engineering, I think grounded theory is the most challenging, and probably the most misunderstood in terms of what is grounded theory the method or grounded theory the theory. And so the students actually read your paper, which I think is a great introduction, and it helps to clear up a lot. And they came with some really interesting questions. So I'm inviting them, if they would like to turn on their video, they will appear and they can ask the question themselves. But I'm actually going to go in order of them appearing in our Slack channel, and ask you some of them and see what you think.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's go.
All right, let's go. So Alessandra, you saw her at the very beginning. If she's not here now, you'll see her at the end for sure. So she says, according to Easterbrook, I think maybe you've read that paper from 2000.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's my go-to right now for the book.
Excellent. Yeah, it was super. I was one of the authors in that paper. It was super, super fun paper to write.
I know.
It was probably my favorite paper of all times to write. It is important. So Alessandra says, Easterbrook says, it is important to understand that in any empirical study, theories have a strong impact on how things are observed and interpreted. In your experience, how can we mitigate these risks of misunderstanding and research bias? Which practical exercises, strategies can be adopted other than self-reflection?
Right. So, no, that's a really good one. So, it's to do, like, I'm just rephrasing the question for my own understanding. So you're talking about the biases that we bring as researchers to the whole idea of data collection and analysis and so forth, right? Cool. Okay, so this is very, very true. It's a very practical, real thing that happens because we are studying humans and we are humans, right? And all of us, whether we like to accept it or not, have our biases. And our opinions and our preferences and backgrounds and experiences that color how we see the world. So we have a particular worldview, and this is, going back to my example of you see different shapes in the cloud because of who we are. So how do you try and find that shape that is possibly more representative of what most people see, I should say? There's no one shape, I guess, but of what most people will accept. All right, yeah, sure, that one definitely looks like a unicorn kind of thing. And that's to do with the rigor of the process, I would say. So self-reflection, as you said, that's definitely part of it, being aware of your own biases. But it's the trusting the process. I mean, it sounds a bit like, yeah, sure, believe in the process. But it's, one of the things I say is whenever you have a doubt or whenever you think you're assuming things, go back to the data and the data will inform you. So, and this can be at a very advanced stage. And as a, young, not so young anymore, but back in the day when you started with Granite theory, I used to have this issue of going back to the data, even though I was quite advanced in my category stages. Anytime I was like, I'm not sure this is really what's happening, I would go back and reanalyze the data. And that can be a bit of a wormhole or a rabbit hole, but yeah, just trusting the data and going back to it and applying the process, which is open coding and constant comparisons to say what the data is actually saying. The other thing you can do, of course, is typically have a research team. So if you are a PhD student or master's student with your supervisors or advisors, then that becomes a really good point of sort of double checking you're on the right track. So oftentimes what will happen is my PhD students will come in with their transcripts of interviews, and they would have done some coding on the side, and I look at them and be like, yep, on the right track, you're assuming, maybe something else is going on. So that third person view is super important really at the early stages because there's someone to check your biases there. And another thing I get my PhD students to do is write down your story before you begin analyzing and write down your biases. So if you are, for example, you've been a software tester, you will have certain biases, say, for testers and against developers, for example. right? So when you go out to study them, don't let that color what you're seeing. So by listing it, almost writing it down, you know your biases. You know, you can put it up on the wall. These are my biases. Like, testers are cool, developers are dumb, whatever. But by having that up front, every time you see it, you can check yourself, and then with the advisors. And the third sort of checkpoint comes from when you put your work out there for review, and you give them enough examples of how you're coding, just like I showed you. Then people can start to see, all right, you're on the right track. You are analyzing this correctly. Yep.
Great, thank you. Wow, I wish I was writing notes and writing some of that down so I could share.
Well, this is being recorded.
Yes, it is. We can go back and write some notes, and it'll be in your book as well, of course. Alessandra asked another good question that I'll sneak in before I move on to Nimi's question. I'm going to just paraphrase it a little bit. So you talked about this process of being iterative and interleaving, and then having to go back, right, to your participants as new concepts or themes emerged, right? And so this is, a practical question. Did you go back and re-interview people that you interviewed initially? How did that work? How did you, from a practical perspective? I hope I paraphrased Alessandra, okay? Yeah.
So there can be a few reasons why you would go back to a particular participant. One could be that it is designed, your study is designed in that manner. It's a bit more longitudinal. So in that you're following a team. Say, for example, the way we did our Becoming Agile paper, it was a cross-sectional view of a snapshot view of what's happening right now. So we would talk to one person, we never return to that person. I don't think for that one I ever returned to any of them. I might be forgetting, I've done a few of these. But it wasn't planned. It wasn't planned to systematically go back to that person. However, you could have a study where you are, say, for example, not talking to 100 people, but you're talking to 2 teams and you're following them closely over 6 months. In that case, you would be going back to the same people, right? So it's by design. The second one is by need. So you collected some data, 3 months, and you have sort of transcribed it, you've made sense of it. And then 3 months down the line, because of the new data that has come in, you have a question about that initial thing and you want to clarify. So you go back to that person, you say, sorry, can I have 5 more minutes? and you go, look, this is what the new concepts are showing me. Can you please share a little bit more? That was a really interesting thing you said about, project dictionaries. You define the same concept. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? So that's like clarification or double checking and going back to them. So by need, you would go back to them. So yeah, those are 2 ways I think that you go back. And even as I said that, I remembered part of answering the first question. The 4th way you can double check you're on the right track is sharing your analysis with your participants, right? Because you are in essence coding what they said. So if they are happy with what you are, analyzing, then you're on the right track. Sorry, that was just answering the 4th way of answering. Yeah. Did that, answer the second one though? I got a bit.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was, just sort of how you deal with that. Yeah. I'm going to move on to Nimi's question, which, and I'm going to start with I guess, a little bit of, a confession in that I have done some studies that really one could call grounded theory, but haven't called them such because I haven't taken it all the way. And it's for practical reasons, right? Because you even said yourself, this study took 3 years, right? That you described in the paper. And so Nimi asks, that it took 3 years to mention. And so you got, several stages in the research. Is it acceptable to split such a study into a series of conference papers? And for example, is it sufficient to explain the taxonomy or knowledge derived from the coding categorization in an initial conference paper and theory formation in a later conference paper? Paper, because research students these days have to think about papers, right? And getting the results out there and getting feedback. So yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. So let me just clarify the point about the 3 years because it's going to sound scary. So grounded theory doesn't have to take 3 years. right? It took me 3 years because it was part of a PhD study, and I ended up with a number of theories. It wasn't just one theory that I ended up with. So if you're looking to develop a theory and you're working on it full time, and it's not the first time you're doing it, it's not going to take 3 years, right? So it was because I was learning to do it as a PhD student, and there were a number, as I said, theories that ended up sort of coming out of it. So that's one part of it, which is how long does it take? On an average, I would say if you have a team that's working on it fairly regularly, and you have a defined sort of, area that you want to look at, one study, it could very well be a year. It doesn't have to be 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, about the conferences, absolutely. And this is exactly what happened. So I can tell you that with my one of my sort of key categories in the roles side of things. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but one of the things that I found in my PhD was that self-organizing teams come up with these informal roles. Okay, so when I got that idea, based on about, I think, 24 participants at that time, I wrote it up as the paper that became the XC 2010 paper. And then after that, I was, because it was in the process, I continued collecting data. And because of theoretical sampling, I saw that there were gaps in my theory. And the gaps was around, most of the data I had collected showed only one view, or primarily one view, of people who were very new to Agile. Right? So it was a one-sided view. So what I did was that's the whole concept of theoretical sampling. You see this gap, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to now collect data from experienced Agile teams. I explicitly went and looked at experienced teams. And that helped shape up those roles that I had found initially and published in XC. And now the roles are a lot more mature, and it shows what it looks like before, what it looks like when you're experienced. So it shows the journey of those roles. And that became the TSC 2013 paper. So it's the same theory about the roles. So you could very well have conference papers along the way that are either focused on the preliminary sort of findings on emerging categories that are strong enough to be published, right? But they may not be the final theory. And then by the end of it, when you have the final theory, it's most likely you have so much to say it cannot be said in a journal paper, in a conference paper, and you opt for a journal paper. So yeah, that happens all the time.
Great, thank you for that answer. I think that actually helps a lot. So I'm going to invite the students, just, turn your video on, you'll appear on the screen. And then if you want to jump in and ask your own question, I'm sure Rashina would love to hear you guys ask the question. I was thinking asking Cassandra's question. Give her a second to see if she wants to come on, but I'll ask it. So she says, I'm going to ask her second question. So she said, you state, initially we preferred the ease of using spreadsheets since it gave us greater freedom in organizing the data. And as the data grew in volume, the spreadsheets got difficult to maintain. So finally, you settled for using printouts of the interview transcripts and physically coding along the margins using pen on paper. Is there any software in the present day that could have potentially solved this issue of data management? It's a great question.
Yeah, totally. So yes, that's very true. I was kind of dabbling with, what do I want to use? It's just, data is just spiraling out of control. So yeah, move from spreadsheets and then just printouts. I would have these fat, printout folders I would be carrying around everywhere of my transcripts and sort of mulling over them. Absolutely. Present day, you've got things like NVivo. So let me just start that into NVivo software that helps with qualitative data analysis. There's also another one. I'm sorry, not feeling well, Cassandra. I hope it wasn't lecture. Cool. And then there's another one is Maxqda. These are two. So since so the NVivo and Maxqda, they help. Now, what I will say though is, and I encourage my PhD students to get on with these organized tools straight up. something I didn't do, but I actually don't regret not having used them. Reason being, it's almost like, again, if I take an analogy, if you are somebody who, yes, Atlas is another good one. Thanks, Peggy. So it's like if you do, you drive your car or any kind of tool that you use, if you know how to work it manually, you will know how to work it automatically. So it's kind of knowing it inside out. So when the physical coding on the margins is really just your manual way of doing it. But if you know how to do that, then you can definitely manage it within NVivo. So having said that, I still haven't used NVivo because I love my, scribblings on the side. That's just me. I'm old-fashioned, unfortunately, in that way. But yeah, most people that I see nowadays use one of these. Rohit suggesting, how do you pronounce that?
Tableau. I didn't know you
Tableau.
could use Tableau for data analysis, but maybe Rohit, you could tell us about that a little bit more later, how you use that tool for doing coding. That's very interesting. I have used Atlas. I do like it. I tend to use what people on my research team want to use, though,
Look, essentially, it's going to help you organize things, and it's going to help you label things and pick things up. The reason I struggled to switch part way was by the time, I figured it was difficult to manage the mountains of data, I'd already come up with my own structure of doing things. So I found NVivo a bit constricting because it was a particular way of organizing things, and I'd already come up with my own. But if you start from the beginning, it's perfect.
Great. I'm going to switch topic a little bit and person. So I hope I'm pronouncing Rohit's name correctly.
Rohit.
Rohit
Agarwal. I'm Indian, I should know.
I didn't know that. So Rohit asks about Agile and that Agile methods value people and interactions over processes and tools. And then goes on to say, what are your views about, in terms of people interaction and efficient processes and tools? Shouldn't those go hand in hand to make an efficient Agile team? I cut out a little bit, but basically asking about that sort of assumption, that it's...
That's a great question, Rohit. Look, anytime some kind of a huge change or revolution comes along, it's usually to challenge the status quo, all right? So when Agile came around, the big sort of message there was people are important. In fact, people are more important than tools. So that was the big sort of marketing slogan, if you like, to really set it apart from what was currently happening. The same you see in Granite theory. As I said before, when it came, it challenged the status quo of deductive is great, but we should also be looking at inductive. Inductive is amazing. So that's kind of how revolutions happen. However, that doesn't mean if inductive is great, deductive is silly or not required. In fact, in my book, I am going to point out that we do largely induction, but there is a little bit of deduction and there is some abduction in Granite theory that people kind of just, skip over. But it does happen. So I'm going to try and make that more obvious. And similarly with Agile, it's the fact that we're trying to shift focus and say people are important doesn't mean the tools aren't important. You still need the tools. They use the tools every day. And this is at the heart of the thing that I just said about writing up a socio-technical Granite theory. Is software engineering is inherently socio-technical. It's socio-technical in a way that you cannot separate the socio from the technical, right? And that is at the heart of your question, I guess, in terms of the people and the tools. They go together, right? The people and the technology, the people and what they're building. Anything, you have to think about programming. When you're writing programming together, it's not just some isolated aspect. You're talking, you're discussing, you're designing, you're writing code. It's so inherently socio-technical. So the tools are super important. But when Agile came, it wanted to sort of shift focus and say, it's not just the tools. Focus on the people, they are more important. So that's kind of, the balance there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question before I really do invite people to turn on some cameras and say hi to you. So this is thinking about the state of the world today with the pandemic. And so in terms of grounded theory, recruiting participants, doing interviews and making observations, those are all essential stages. So how do you think, the pandemic and the situation we're in today will make this process more difficult or maybe easier due to online interactions? And Dave asked that question.
That's an excellent question, Dave. Very practical. Look, we are actually running against these issues now as my students start to, look at data collection and whatnot. So the basic line of Granite theory, again, I take the Agile example, for both is face-to-face interaction is the best one, right? Because you're talking to somebody, when you see them in person, you can see what they're saying, you can hear it, you can see their facial expression. Somebody like me, a lot of hand movements, and all of that helps. And all of those cues help in inferring meaning of what they're saying, right? So face to face is the best. Next up, you could have like something like this, which is virtual. You can still see them. One level down, you're like listening to them, you can't see them. One level down, you're texting, not see or hear them, and so forth. So there are levels of how much information that medium carries, right? And based on that, we try and go for the gold standard, which is the maximum information we can get in a face-to-face interaction. In this pandemic situation, obviously we can't have the face-to-face. Well, depends on where you are in the world, or with your face masks on and meter distance. But this virtual environment, and I think there are two sides to it. One is you might find actually people have maybe a little bit more time on their hands. This is very, very personal and subjective. So some people finding there's no time, some people finding there's more time, some people finding this whole virtual situation just I can't handle it, I'm completely zoomed out. Some people are like, this is great, I'm in my pajamas, who cares? So you've got all of those people, and it's not until you actually start reaching out to people to recruit them that you may realize that, all right, they're actually up for it. In terms of the interviews, observations, super difficult. Observations, because you want to walk around the place and watch things. You could be sitting in on a meeting quietly with your camera off. In fact, my sort of guess on that is it might even help with removing something, or at least lessening the Hawthorne effect, which is the observer's effect. So when people know you're being observed, they behave differently. But if you are on a Zoom call in a meeting with your camera off, just quietly on the side taking notes, it actually might be reduced. So these are things we need to grapple with and see how it sort of pans out in the pandemic. I tell you what, I'm getting pretty sick of it. I hope it just gets better.
Yeah, I put in our chat a book called Virtual Ethnography by Christine Hine. And she talks about doing, it's actually quite old, but doing ethnography online. And she has a newer one as well. So there's some advice on doing this. Yeah, and I had another thought and it flew out of my head. I'm going to invite the students now to, I won't force you to ask a question, but just join us back and maybe turn your cameras on. Just so that if you want to say hello, you can. Let me see. I will turn that off. There we go. And so here's some of the students. And yeah, so Rashina, that was amazing. I am just so grateful to you for spending the time on your Saturday on a long weekend in full lockdown in Melbourne, I believe right now, to share your insights with us and to take the time to answer our questions so thoughtfully. And I'll open it up if anybody else wants to ask a question or just say thank you, or if you have any closing remarks. Any other thoughts, guys?
This was really awesome and helped me to better understand the paper, because I had a rough idea what was going on, but the presentation was really good and helped me really understand what's going on. I just had one small question. This came to me when you were giving the presentation. When we are going through like the abstraction level, when we are increasing the abstraction, how does that how is that relevant to generalizability? Is that like, if you're saying that if every person comes up with a different result, does that mean it cannot be generalizable? I don't know. It's like, I'm just asking to see, how do you think on that? Yeah.
That's really thoughtful. Very, very cool. So increasing levels of abstraction have to do with the fact that, remember I told you one interview is going to end up with, say, 6 to 7 pages of data. And from that, when you're open coding in particular, just openly coding for everything, there's mountains of data, right? Now, and you saw the end products, right? You saw those diagrams with, so how do you go from amount of stuff to that amount of, that's the abstraction. So that's what we're talking about. Now, in there somewhere, there's generalizability in the sense that it's local generalizability. It's locally generalizable to the context that was studied. It should definitely be applicable to the people you have studied. One odd person might be like, that bit there doesn't happen for me, and that's fine. But the overall, theory will ring true with them. They'll be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's kind of what's happening. Sure. And that should happen. That's the relevance and resonance, and that should happen. In terms of larger generalizability, what I have seen, my theories, for example, I try and present to industrial audiences, not just academic conferences. So I'll go out and talk to a bunch of practitioners who are not my participants, who've never seen this before. And so that is a great way to check relevance and resonance. And a lot of times I've got people come up, and especially with the roles, for instance, come up and say, I could recognize each one of them. In fact, I'm texting my friends right now, you're a mentor, you're a coordinator. So they see that. And that is a great way to check that local generalizability has a little bit of a stretch value within similar contexts, right? We cannot claim universality, we just can't. Now, having said that, I will also throw in, for good measure, I don't believe any survey, no matter how big, can I claim universality either. So it's about what's useful and what carries to as many different contexts or similar contexts as possible. But if you say, for example, if you're interested in look at the TED Talk that Peggy talked about, that's me taking something that was a grounded theory in software engineering, studied with a particular set of people, and be like, what if I apply this to the societal context? That's as big and as much of a jump I've ever made. I cannot publish this. That's why it's a TED Talk. Because that's my what if proposition, right? My reviewers will kill me. They'll, just cut it out because where's the evidence? But it rings true with a lot of people. I get interviewed all the time about, how do you see Agile nations panning out in pandemic programming and so forth. So some mediums are for some things and some mediums are for some others. But great question, thanks.
Yeah, very good question. All right, well, I think unless anybody wants to jump in with another question, I think let's clap or do the sparkly hands that Greg taught us last week, whatever you'd like, that I will clap. Thank you so much, Rashina. That was amazing. So helpful.
Thank you. This is in New Zealand Sign Language.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, I like that, actually.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
So much.
Thanks, Peggy. Such an honor and such thoughtful questions. You actually read the paper. That's amazing. That's all an instructor can ask for. Like, yay!
Yeah.
And then secondly, you really thought about it and had these questions. So awesome.